But it was Richard Owen who invented the word dinosaur, and no, he wasn't the first man to discover them. He actually got his collection from a doctor, a medical doctor who went bankrupt, who really was into bones. Unfortunately, digging them up rather than mending them, that's the reason he went bankrupt. But he did make some money out of his bones, because Richard Owen's museum paid £4,000. Today that's probably about $30,000 or $40,000 for his collection of dinosaur bones. But they weren't called dinosaurs yet. Richard Owen studied these and said, you know, they look like the bones of big lizards. We don't have any big lizards this size around. And so he came up with this new word, dinosaur. And that's now 152 years ago.
152
Yeah,
years.
it's a long time ago.
Let's go back to where they found these big bones. Did anybody have any theory about them and about what may have created them back then?
Well, Richard Owen was sure that they were the monsters that God made. In fact, that's why he argued to his dying day with Charles Darwin. In fact, if you just hold up our video we've just made on Jehovah's Park, you'll see we've used that little byline at the bottom, Jehovah's Park, the monsters God made. And we'll be putting up our phone number later on where folks can get these from, and they can just leave a message on the answering machine, because I think the office is empty at the moment, we're all out. But they'll get your message if you're interested. And if you look at these, the bones were all found in mud or limestone or sediment that had been washed in. So one oughtn't to be surprised that the first geologists, who basically were Christians, said, well, look, these are the remains of animals that were destroyed at the time of Noah's flood. And basically that's where we're getting back to. Some of them survived after the flood, of course, because I'm sure Noah had 2 of each kind on board. But as we come from the time of Noah's flood to the present, we've got to again remember what the Bible says has happened to the world. You're a fairly attractive young lady, but you see, back in Abraham's
young
day,
part. That's
yeah,
nice.
young
Thank
is
you.
fine. Abraham's wife Sarah was still an attractive young lady at 90 years of age, and Eve was still an attractive lady at 900 years of age. You know, from the time of creation down to the present, the world has degenerated to the point where we no longer live as long, and neither did the monsters like dinosaurs. Crocodiles are still here because they live in the water. They've been much more protected than the monsters that lived on the land, but crocodiles don't get as big as they used to be. You know, they only live to be 100, so they get to be about 20 or 30 feet at the most. The ones in the rocks are 52 feet long. Dinosaurs in the rocks are 50 to 60 feet long, but they're not even here anymore, because I'm pretty sure after the flood they didn't live as long, they didn't grow as big. As we migrated out from the Middle East, they got in our road, they were getting smaller, we were getting bolder and more numerous, so we bumped them off, but we called them dragons in those days.
Oh, good. Well,
So that's where it all fits together.
Let's talk about those dragons a
Very
little
good.
bit. That was so interesting when I was reading or watching your video about that we always thought of those as myths or legends.
Yeah, we sure did. In fact, you know, when I was brought up, I don't come from a church family background. I would have, you know, categorized dragons and creation all in the same fairy story realm. But the more I've traveled around the world, the more I've interviewed many of the native races, the more I've looked up all the old records. In fact, my family comes from Scotland. It's funny, when you go back to my hometown in Scotland, the phone book is entirely full of MacKays, or MacKays as you say. It's absolutely useless. You don't know who you're ringing up. But over there you'll find that in Scotland you can find the printed records of the death of the last dragon, because it didn't happen until about 300 or 400 years ago. And it's written down in the history books as the last dragon in Scotland was killed by such and such on such and such a day. And that's just not like a myth. Myths don't normally have dates and times and places and names in them. And if you go to Germany, you'll find the same thing. So that people like Attila the Hun and that are actually recorded as being involved in the death of the last of these dragons. When you come to North America, you find no matter which Indian group you talk to, like the Sioux people used to have a story, in fact they still have a story, about this huge lizard that flew through the sky, and it was struck by lightning, fell to the ground, and when they found it, it had claws on its wings.
Are we talking like the pteranodon or
Well, you know, in our mind, a lizard with claws, you go to the museums and you see these big pterodactyls or pterodons, you know, and the description is amazing. you know, from people who've never sort of been to museums or studied these, that they would come up with such a story that you and I would say, well, that's a dinosaur, that's a pterosaur, or, you know, the Loch Ness Monster. Just all the descriptions are in the plesiosaur bracket. And the Loch Ness Monster wasn't just invented to get American tourists to Scotland, because the first Christian missionaries wrote down the records of the stories of the people who were already there, you know, 1500 years ago, and they still told exactly the same stories about these big monsters with long necks that lived in the lakes.
And were they fire breathers?
Were they fire breathers?
Dragons in my stories were always fire breathers.
Well, I don't think the Loch Ness Monster would have been a fire breather. It wouldn't have been much use in the water. But it is true, whether you look at the stories from secular sources or even in the Bible. There's a marvellous description in the book of Job of a monster that was covered in scales, that had a mouth, you know, that was unbelievably big in size and full of sharp teeth. You see, by the time of Job, who lived around about the time of the Tower of Babel, he was still living till he was 400 or so years of age, so the monsters were still getting to be fairly big. And in fact, the monster in Job is described as not only as having such savage teeth, it's covered with jagged scales that left a mark in the mud as it went. It was so big nobody could kill it, and that breathed fire. You know, and Christians need to come to grips with the fact that this is the same book that says Jesus healed a man's withered arm. It talks about a monster that breathed fire. Now, we've got a few animals today that still breathe superheated things, and we tend never to hear about them much. But in Australia, we've got this little beetle, you know, you can put it in your hand and you'll hear bang, bang, and when you look at your hand, you'll see little burn marks everywhere. And this little creature uses that superheated gases to defend itself against other insects these days. Whether it once used it to take off from the ground or what, I don't know. But it certainly can burn you.
Like a reverse jet.
Yeah, like a reverse jet, that's right. Well, actually, it can turn this jet in any direction. It's far more sophisticated than our jet planes, who are sort of they go up or they go down, but they can't turn their jets in any direction. This little animal can, and it emits superheated gases. And so if beetles can do it, then big bug-eyed monsters could do it once upon a time too. And when you have a look at the skulls in museums, what I'd encourage the people who are doing, the young people out there, have a look at some of the dinosaur skulls, because they'll find there's not only nostrils in them, there's other cavities as well. And normally you'll read the story, it says, we're not quite sure what these cavities were for. Perhaps they were for making noises as the dinosaurs mated, you know, or making boom, boom, boom noises like frogs do. Perhaps they were used for storing the ingredients that when they were emitted would become superheated gases, and hence our accounts in the Bible and other books that said they were fire breathing. And, you know, that's what the Bible has to say, and it's in the stories all around the world too.
All right. Well, there's even stories about Chinese dragons and whatever. This is really fascinating to me. We got so little time whenever you're here, and we're going to give away some things.
We are too, yes.
A little later in the show.
Yep, we'll do that.
And so they've got to stick around. This is an hour-long show today, and we've got more things to show you, some fossils that he's brought from Australia and some other places around the world, and we'll find out more about his schedule, but let's go to a break right now and we'll be right back.
Hey! Ian, freeze! Get the can! Get rid of the fire! Get the can!
Wow. Were dinosaurs really like that? How do we know what they look like?
Well, it certainly looks impressive on Jurassic Park, doesn't it? And I was really thrilled when the robot companies gave us permission to film all their robots, and it really is great. But how do we know what they look like? Well, I brought along a couple of fossils to help us answer that question. You can hold them up for the viewers. I was just in Wales last week and collecting rocks and fossils, and that's a beautiful little one. It's just a shell. Can we get the picture of that up there so folks can see what we're talking about? Just about coming up soon. And when you dig up a whole shell like that, then it's very easy to say what they look like. Of course, there was an animal in that shell that came out of the bottom part, and that's not there. So you could guess what the animal looked like, even though you know what it lived in. Now, in cases like this one here, there's another one there. You find that's a trilobite. We just ran a field trip in Canada, and we had students and science teachers and all that, and that trilobite there is fairly easy to figure out what it looked like because the whole thing is impressed into it. And so you've just got a mould of it, and so if you filled that up with plaster and took the plaster out, you'd have a beautiful copy of exactly what the animal was like.
Okay, now you had another piece that
Yeah, I
went
did.
with
In fact, this is exactly the opposite side. So there's a natural mould. That's the animal itself that's on this one, and it's left the mould.
This actually was like
It was like
this.
that, and we split it apart, and the students took home heaps of these. It was a great reminder. These little trilobites have got 3 parts in them, and even the eyes are preserved. And you can pull the lenses out and actually look through them, and you know, they have all the brilliance of the same sort of optical precision in some of these cameras we've got in the room at the moment. So there's brilliant evidence of God as creator. But see, there's 2 different sorts of fossils that we've picked up so far. One is where only the shell, the outside part, was preserved, and you have to guess what the animal's like. The other is where the whole animal's there and it's impressed in the mud. Pull it apart, you can see the outside, you can see the inside, and you actually pull it apart and find out exactly how the animal's working.
Now, how do we know do we have an intact dinosaur,
Do
or
we
especially
have an
a
intact
T-Rex?
dinosaur? Well, we have T-Rexes nilly. Right, we've been getting bigger and better specimens of T-Rexes, but you know, I was just reading a new science magazine yesterday. It said, with the latest discoveries, what have we had to change about T-Rex? Most people, despite the fact you see lovely big T-Rexes on Jurassic Park, don't realise up until recently we'd never even found the funny little arms on the T-Rex skeleton. We'd never found the whole tail. So that these ideas were borrowed off other dinosaurs and sort of a mixture of a jigsaw of this dinosaur and that dinosaur to make up a final T-Rex. And so this author, who's quite a notable scientist, said, with our latest discoveries, we've discovered the arms are even shorter than the ones that have been on the traditional models. You know, the cute little arms that T-Rex is supposed to have. And hinted in there, of course, is the fact that if you don't find a whole skeleton, then your picture is, at best, an educated guess. At worst, it's just fantasy. But if you can think about that new T-Rex, you know, with a much shorter arms and things like that, and we're still trying to figure out whether he had 2 claws or 3 claws. We haven't found everything yet, as far as I'm aware. Most people don't realise the monsters shown on, say, Jurassic Park couldn't even reach down to put anything in their mouth.
Couldn't reach his mouth.
And he couldn't hold anything to bite its head off. And the fact of the matter is, despite the way T-Rex is presented, when you actually dig up the fossil teeth, the fossil jaws, what you find is an animal that couldn't have ripped your head or my head off if it tried. Its teeth were so fragile they would have fallen out. At best, T-Rex would have been a scavenger. You know, when you have a look at the biblical description, all of the animals started off as harmless vegetarians. And the evidence from animals like T-Rex tells us that they weren't designed to be killers in the first place. Some of the dinosaurs we only know from a couple of bones. And so you can say without a shadow of a doubt, all those lovely big pictures in the picture books for children are just fantasy. But when you get the pictures of T-Rex with yellow spots here and black spots there, they're making it up. When they're going, you don't dig up noises
They have
in the
no
rocks.
idea.
Have no idea. So you can probably say, even if you had a whole skeleton, what the animal does, what you make it eat, is all just supposition. It's all just theory, not fact.
Okay. Well, this whole Noah's Ark theory now, we want to go back and put that in a little perspective, because I think most people, if they think about dinosaurs at all, they probably think they just died out in the flood. There weren't any on Noah's Ark, if they ever even thought about that. It hadn't occurred to me that he put any on the Ark. I thought they would have been too big.
Well, if you'd have already watched our Jehovah's Park, or the viewers had their own copy, and we'll remind them again, we'll put our phone number up that they can ring a little later on. We actually got one of our computer graphics experts to put a model of the Ark there and show how big the dinosaurs were in comparison. In fact, he did quite a good job. He did it better than I even thought of. You know, he has Ma and Pa, Triceratops, walking up, the whole family of Triceratops, and then when they get to the bottom of the plank, of course, Ma and Pa just say goodbye to the little ones, and the little ones go up the plank. Because what most people miss is that dinosaurs started out that big. You know, dinosaurs like crocodiles start out as eggs you could hold in your hands. And Noah had no reason to take big ones on board, but we must remember the Bible says that God sent 2 of every kind of creature to Noah. And it's not a problem. They didn't have to swim across oceans or anything, because the description of the world in Genesis is of a place where the water is in one place. So there was no 75% oceans separating continents like we've got in this degenerate world that we live in by comparison. The water was all in one place, so no matter where the animals lived, they had no trouble walking to where Noah was, and there was no reason for Noah to take big, strong, old ones on. Just strong, healthy baby ones would have been far more suited. And if you're worried about how Noah had to feed all these animals,